how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all 389 Bach chorale harmonizations. We're going to be looking at Valet will ich dir geben today, which roughly translates to Farewell, I gladly bid thee. It's an interesting chorale. Some of the modulations I'm not 100% sure on, but I have a succinct analysis that I'm going to present, and I hope it comes across in a sensible fashion. The chords themselves weren't very difficult to analyze. It was more so just deciding, how did I want to interpret a key at this particular point, or how exactly do I want to point out a modulation, like if there is a common chord, which one is it? The usual suspects of things that are bones of contention with other people who analyze the same music. So that being said, let's just hop right into it. We're going to start by analyzing the key. So we have two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major and we end on D major. So I think it's safe to say that this chorale is in the key of D major. And we start on a one chord, just a root position D major triad. We have some passing tones in the lower voices, and then again we get another one chord, another D major triad, just respelled. The upper voices leap up a fourth each, or rather, one leaps up a fifth, the other leaps up a fourth, some voice exchange. And then we get an inverted one chord here, F sharp, A, D, and A. So we don't need to re-Roman numeral, all we need to do is change the figured bass there. And then with the eighth note pattern in the lower voices, we get root position again. It's very accented, so that's why I put it in parentheses. And then we have G, G, D, and B. It's a root position G major triad, so we'll just put a 4 there, because G is the subdominant. We have a passing seventh in the bass, and then we have E, G, G, and C sharp. That is a C sharp diminished triad in first inversion. Passing tone in the tenor. And then we have B, B, G, and D. That is a 4 chord in first inversion. G major over B. Passing tone in the bass. D, A, F sharp, and D. We have a root position tonic triad, D major. Passing tones in the inner voices. And then we have another one chord, just the bass leaps down an octave. So what kind of cadence is this? Well, it's like 1 going to 1, but the chord that precedes it is 4. So it's a plagal cadence, 4 going to 1. So it's like a non-dominant that cadences on, or a non-dominant preceding a tonic. So it's a very stable cadence, no real dissonance just from the chords themselves. I mean, I guess you can create dissonance with the suspensions and the counterpoint, but there is no dominant tonic relationship in this cadence. So again, we get a massive leap. We get a 2-octave leap in the bass. How crazy is that? D, D, D. Insane vocal writing. Bach just wrote, he was a true egalitarian. He wrote how he did for the instruments, and I'm grateful for it. But if you were a bassist singing, or if you're a bass vocalist singing a 2-octave leap, not very comfortable. And even the tenor has an octave leap way up to this A right here, matching the alto, which is already singing kind of like in the mid-upper part of their range. So we have another one chord there, no need to reanalyze. And then we have an A sharp diminished 7th chord here, A sharp, G, C sharp, and E. It's fully diminished. And if it's a fully diminished 7th chord, it must be the leading tone of something else. And A sharp is the leading tone of B, which is the submediant. So this is a 7, 7 of 6. And we would expect that to go to a B minor chord, which it does. B, F sharp, B, and D. Passing 7th in the bass. G sharp, F, B, and D. Another fully diminished 7th chord, but this time G sharp is the leading tone of A, so this would be a 7, 7 of 5, and we would expect a 5 chord to come after that, which it does. A, E, A, and C sharp, which is just a 5 chord. So some secondary dominant, sorry, I moved my paper there. 7, 7 of 6, 6, 7, 7 of 5, 5, and then we get a cadence on 1, D, F sharp, A, and D. And Bach doubled the voices like I would expect. Usually at cadences, that's when it matters. It's just when you see them in the chorale, in the middle of the phrase, it doesn't matter so much. But come the cadence arrives, that's when the doubling really starts to abide by the textbook. All right, we get another 1 chord here. If we look ahead, we have a cadence, a really interesting cadence here on F sharp minor. So we modulate to the key of F sharp minor briefly, and it's an imperfect authentic cadence because of the chords that precede it and the fact that the tonic is not in the soprano. So I guess we're going to have to decide when the modulation happens. So we get a 1 chord here, D, F sharp, A, and D, with passing tones in the soprano and the tenor. And then we get D, A, D, and F sharp, really getting up there in the upper 3 voices. So another 1 chord, no need to reanalyze. Passing 7th of the bass, B, B, D, and F sharp. That is a 6 chord in the key of D major. And in the key of F sharp minor, it is the 4 chord. So that was my point of deciding where the modulation happened. And then we have G sharp, E, B, and E. And there are a couple of ways to analyze this. You could analyze this as 5 of 3, but it's not really functioning that way. We're going to call it 7-6 because 4, 7, 1 is kind of it's a progression that you would expect, and it's one that you see. And right here, similarly to how we saw earlier, the eighth note pattern skips the stepwise motion to just reinvert the chord into its root position. And then we have F sharp, C sharp, A, and E. So we have a 1 chord here with this suspension that turns it into a 7th chord, but we're just going to call it a 1 chord, root position. And then we have G sharp, B, B, and D. We kind of have a little bit of a passing 2 here. We'll mark that. Then we have A, E, and C sharp. That's a 3 chord. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the alto. Then we have F sharp, G sharp, G sharp, C. I think this is an accented non-chord tone. This F natural came across in my software as an F natural, which confused me a lot, but when I conferred back with the chorale, it's actually an E sharp. It just spelled it as F natural because the software doesn't know what a key is. You can define what a key is in the engraving software. If you tell it to think in those parameters, that's fine. But as soon as you introduce any sense of chromaticism, it doesn't know. So you have to re-spell the pitches. So if we look at this F natural as E sharp, we have E sharp, G sharp, G sharp, and C sharp, and that is a 5/6 chord, C sharp major triad over E sharp, and then we get a 1 chord in root position. But it's imperfect authentic for a couple of reasons. One is 3 going before 5 is kind of atypical. 5/6 is usually not the chord that precedes a perfect authentic cadence. We usually get root position movement. And the soprano doesn't have the big reason that makes it imperfect authentic is the fact that the soprano does not have the tonic in it. Alright, good. Next beat, we have the same chord, just some voice switching. If we look ahead, we have a modulation, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major. So we'll go ahead and just say that this is now our 6 in the key of A major, because remember, F sharp minor is the relative minor to A major. So now I could move this up a little bit so we could see our analysis on the bottom. We then have B, B, G sharp, and D. That is a G sharp diminished triad over B, so that would be a 7/6 chord in the key of A major. Voice leaps down an octave here, and this is an accented non-chord tone. This is just a 7/6 suspension that's happening here between the alto and the bass. It's a very common thing that Bach does between the alto and the bass particularly. And then we have C sharp, E, A, and C sharp. That is a 1 chord in first inversion, just a 1-6, passing tone in the bass, and then we have E, E, A, and D. If we look past this E, because it's an accented non-chord tone, and this E right here, which is also an accented non-chord tone, the voices split in opposite directions in contrary motion, right, and turn into a D major triad, D, F sharp, A, and B. My apologies, not a D major triad, but rather a B minor triad, a B minor 7 over D. So instead of a 4 chord, it is a 2-6-5, which is basically a 4 with a 2 in the bass, or a 4 chord with a B in it as well. And then we have E, E, G sharp, and B, which is an E major triad in root position, so just a 5 chord. And then we get 1. Perfect authentic cadence. Root position 5 going to root position 1. The tonic is in the soprano. 2-6-5-1 is a pretty traditional cadential formula. Alright, moving ahead. This is probably the most interesting part of the chorale. We get a modulation to E, but whether it's an E major or E minor is, I think, up for debate. The way this cadence arrives, it sounds like a half cadence in E minor, but we get C sharps and D naturals, but really no D sharps until the half cadence at the end of the phrase. So I'm not 100% certain as to whether or not we're in E minor or E major. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and call it E minor because that's what the cadence sounds like to me. But the page doesn't really reveal whether or not we're in the key of E minor or E major explicitly. From A major, it would make more sense to go to E major. But because we're nearing the end of the chorale, maybe going to E minor would be more sensible because E major would be taking you in the wrong direction on the circle of fifths, because E major is further away from D than A major is. And Bach knows that the chorale is coming towards an end, but I don't know what would be stopping him from, just doing a direct modulation, which he ends up doing anyways, which is kind of interesting. So we're going to go ahead and call this chord right here. We could have called this the common chord. I'm calling it this one because it just looks a little better spaced out on the page. This is a modulation to E minor. This 6 turns into 4-6. Remember uppercase because we have C sharp. It's almost like this is E Dorian, so we're looking at E minor through a D major lens almost, because we don't have D sharps. We have D naturals, which is interesting. Bach does that a lot. We see D major. We see a major key or a minor phrase through a major lens. So you get like a Dorian sound or a Phrygian sound. Most of the time they've been Dorian, at least the chorales that I've looked at so far. These little Dorian detours. But then we go from 4 to D, A, D, and F sharp. That's just a root position 7 chord. So 4 going to 7, or we could call that 5 of 3, which is actually where it goes. We can call this 7. I'm going to call it 7. We could also call it 5 of 3. I'm going to put that in parentheses underneath it because I think they're both valid analysis, ways of analyzing this chord. And then we have some passing tones in the outer voices. I think because 7 is going to 3, we could call it 5 of 3. But 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, like the falling fifths progression that goes around the entirety of the scale, from tonic to tonic. 4 goes to 7, and then 7 goes to 3, which is eventually where the progression goes, because this is just a G major triad, G, B, D, and B. But I don't know. Like I said, they both are the same thing for the most part. But regardless, this 7 chord gets inverted right here, and it gets re-inverted with this pattern where we get sort of a third leap down in this 8th note figure, which we've seen a couple of times now. We've seen it here, and we've also seen it here. And here was also a 7th chord as well. So that's kind of, or not a 7th chord, my apologies, a 7 chord, not to confuse the two. But that being said, 3, we have some passing tones right here, and then we have F sharp, D, F sharp, and A. Makes it almost feel like we're sort of in the key of G major rather than the key of B minor, but this whole phrase cadences on B major, which suggests that even though E minor and G major are being kind of flirted with at the same time, the cadence sort of governs how I'm looking at the entirety of the phrase. So whether you say this is a section in G major, and then it modulates to E minor at the end, that's entirely up to you, but I'd say the C sharps kind of weaken that stance. But anyways, F sharp, D, F sharp, A, we go back to 7. 3 going back to 7 is kind of interesting, and it's in first inversion. The passing 7th in the bass, passing 7th in the tenor, and a passing tone in the bass. And this is where we get our first D sharp in proximity to the cadence. D sharp, B, F sharp, and A. This is a 5 chord, a B7 chord over D sharp, so 5, 6, 5. And then we get our first E minor chord, E minor, B, E minor, or E, B, E, and G. So just a root position 1 chord. And then we cadence on 5, not 5, 7, but just 5 by itself. Okay, so moving forward to the last cadence, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. There's also a little point of, this can be argued as to whether or not we are in the key of G major before this, but we get a little, I'm calling this a direct modulation because we get a D7 chord here, and that would be 5, 7 of 4, or 5, 6, 5 rather, of 4, and it immediately goes to 4 in root position. D7 going to G major with a passing tone in the bass, and then we get B, B, D, and F sharp, which would be our 6 chord, or it could be 3 in the key of G major, but I think it's not enough time spent in the key of G major and not enough tonic focus. Just because something's preceded by its secondary dominant doesn't really mean anything about the fact that it's modulated. As you can see, we're going right back into the realm of something that's more likely to be found in the key of D major, at least chord progression wise. Passing 7th in the bass, G, B, D, and E. If that was a D up there, there'd be more of an argument, I think, for G. But this is just an an E minor 7 chord over G, so 2, 6, 5. Again, which turns into not a 5-3, but a 7-5-3. This time because the third leap in the bass, and then we get A, E, C sharp, and E, with a C sharp, and E rather. Oh, I went the whole chorale without making, I made so few mistakes with the staff reading. I'm getting better at it. A, C sharp, and E, which is just a root position 5 chord with a passing 7th in the bass, and then we cadence on 1. So the chorale, I think, other than sort of the modulations that are going on here, whether this should have been an analysis in G major rather than an E minor, ultimately I decided to look at the whole phrase through E minor because the cadence modulations are more of a permanent thing in my mind. That's just my bias. But if modulations, if you don't even think about tonicizations as a thing, and every single time you see a dominant precede a chord that is a chromatic dominant, I think there's an argument to be made about the fact that that's actually a micro modulation. But personally, I think that there's a difference between modulations and tonicizations, and my analysis reflects that. But that being said, overall, pretty straightforward chorale to analyze. It's just the modulations and picking out where they happen and how to go about being consistent with them. All in all, a very beautiful chorale, and it was a delight to analyze. I'm looking forward to tomorrow's analysis, everyone. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, and take care.